Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the word red has vanished from your mind. You can still see a red apple, you can still point to it, but you have no word for what makes it look different from the blue sky, the green grass, or the yellow sun. Would the world actually look different? At first, you might think the answer is obviously no. Your eyes would still receive light, your brain would still process wavelengths, the apple would still look the way an apple looks, but the real answer is far stranger, because the words you use for color can change what your brain notices, remembers, and separates from everything around it. And that raises a much bigger question. If you had never learned a word for blue, would blue still feel like a separate thing? You probably learned the names of colors so early that you barely remember learning them. Red, blue, green, yellow. You may have learned them from toys, picture books, clothes, crayons, or someone pointing at something and saying, "That's red." It felt like you were learning labels, but your brain was doing something much more interesting. It was learning how to divide the visual world into categories. Think about the colors of a rainbow. The light reaching your eyes does not arrive with little labels attached to it. There is no tiny tag saying blue. There is no border in the sky saying green ends here. Instead, visible light exists across a continuous range of wavelengths, and your visual system turns that physical information into the experience you call color. Then language enters the picture. A word gives your brain a compact way to refer to a part of that enormous visual spectrum. And once you have that word, you can talk about the color, remember it, compare it, and search for it. So what happens when a language does not divide colors in exactly the same way yours does? This question became famous through the work of anthropologist Brent Berlin and linguist Paul Kay. In their 1969 book, Basic Color Terms, Berlin and Kay compared color categories across dozens of languages. They argued that languages tend to develop basic color terms in partially predictable patterns. Not every language starts with the same number of color words. Some make fewer broad distinctions, others make many more, and that created a fascinating possibility. Maybe language is not simply describing the colors your brain already sees. Maybe language is helping organize what your brain sees. But there is an important distinction. Having fewer color words does not mean having fewer colors in your eyes. Your visual system does not suddenly become colorblind because your vocabulary is smaller. The light is still there, the photoreceptors in your eyes are still responding. Your brain is still receiving information. What can change is how easily you divide that information into meaningful categories. Imagine a huge box filled with thousands of slightly different shades. Without labels, you could still see every shade. But finding a particular shade might be harder. Now imagine someone draws a line through the box and says, everything on this side is blue, everything on that side is green. Suddenly, the same continuous collection of colors has become easier to organize. Words can work like those mental boundaries. This became even more interesting in experiments by psychologist Eleanor Rosch and later researchers working with different language communities. Rosch studied the Dani people of Papua New Guinea, whose language was often described as having relatively few basic color terms. The important finding was not that the Dani could not see colors. They could. Instead, research suggested that people can categorize and remember colors even when their language gives them relatively broad color categories. That was a warning against a simple idea. Language does not build your visual system from scratch. Your brain already has powerful ways of detecting differences in light and color. But language can sit on top of that system and influence how information is organized. And this is where the story gets strange, because two people can look at almost the same color and still experience the task of identifying it differently. Researchers have tested this by showing people color chips that sit close together. Sometimes the colors fall on opposite sides of a language boundary. For example, one language might have separate everyday words for two shades that another language treats as one broad category. When people are asked to quickly tell those colors apart, language can sometimes give an advantage to the distinction their language makes. That effect is called categorical perception. In simple terms, your brain can become especially sensitive to a difference when your language gives that difference a useful category. But there is another twist. The effect is not always permanent. It can depend on what you're doing. If you're naming colors, language can strongly influence the task. If you're simply looking at colors, other parts of your visual system can still detect differences that your vocabulary does not name. That matters, because it means your words are not prison bars around perception. They are more like tools, useful tools, powerful tools. But tools you can sometimes put down. Psychologist Lera Boroditsky has spent years studying how language can influence thought, including how linguistic categories affect attention and memory. Her broader research supports a fascinating idea. The language you speak can encourage your brain to pay attention to certain distinctions more readily than others. Not because your language controls everything you think. It doesn't. You can think about things you do not have words for. You can perceive things you cannot name. And you can learn new categories later in life. But language can make some mental distinctions easier to grab. Think about this in everyday life. A wine expert may describe tiny differences between shades that look nearly identical to you. A painter may distinguish dozens of colors that you casually call blue. A designer may notice subtle shifts between warm gray, cool gray, beige, and off-white. You are not necessarily seeing less than they are. You may simply have less practice dividing what you see into useful categories. The more you learn, the more distinctions become available to your attention, and color is only one example. Your brain does this everywhere: faces, sounds, emotions, animals, plants, foods, even people. Imagine seeing two unfamiliar dog breeds for the first time. You might think they look almost identical. Then someone teaches you their names. Suddenly, you start noticing differences: the ears, the muzzle, the posture, the coat, the shape of the head. The label did not create those physical differences. It gave your attention a handle. Color words can work the same way. But now imagine the opposite. What if your language had a single everyday word covering a region that your language currently splits into several color names? Would all those shades collapse into one giant color in your mind? Probably not. Your eyes would still detect variation. Your brain would still process it. You could still learn to distinguish the shades. You simply might not have the same automatic linguistic shortcuts for talking about them. This is why the popular claim that some people cannot see a color because their language has no word for it is misleading. A missing word is not a missing wavelength. A vocabulary gap is not the same thing as a visual deficit. Your eyes do not need English to see blue. They do not need a dictionary to see red. Your visual system existed long before modern color names, and that takes you somewhere much deeper. Because human beings often confuse naming something with creating it. You give an emotion a name and it feels easier to talk about. You learn the word nostalgia and suddenly an old feeling has a handle. You learn anxiety and a vague physical sensation can become something you can describe. You learn a word for a kind of social behavior and suddenly you start recognizing it more easily. The world was already there, the category was waiting to be built. Language helps you build it. This does not mean every word changes perception in the same way. Some effects are small, some are strong only under certain conditions, and some famous claims about language completely controlling thought have not survived careful research. The strongest modern view is much more interesting than either extreme. Language does not create your entire reality, but it can influence which parts of reality become easier to notice, sort, remember, and communicate. So return to that red apple. Imagine you grew up without a word for red. You look at the apple, you see it. You know it is different from the sky. You can probably learn to find another object with the same appearance. You can notice when the apple becomes darker. You can tell when it changes. Nothing magical has erased the color. But if someone asks which one is red, you may have no category with that name to retrieve. Now imagine that someone teaches you the word red. Suddenly, one piece of your visual world has a name. You can ask for it. You can remember it. You can compare it. You can warn someone about it. You can tell a story about it. The color was there before the word. But the word changed what you could do with the color, and that may be the most important distinction. Language does not necessarily determine what you can see. It can change what you can easily notice, organize, remember, and share. Your brain is constantly turning a massive stream of sensory information into a manageable world. There are more details reaching your senses than you could ever consciously track. So your brain has to choose. What matters? What can be ignored? What deserves a category? What deserves a name? Words can help answer those questions. And once a category becomes useful, your attention can start looking for it. That is why learning something new can sometimes feel like the world suddenly became more detailed. You buy a certain type of car, and suddenly you notice that model everywhere. You learn a new bird species, and walks outside become full of birds you never noticed before. You learn a new musical instrument, and songs suddenly contain sounds that were previously invisible to your attention. The world did not suddenly change, your categories did. Color gives you one of the clearest examples because you can actually watch your categories develop. A child may begin with a few broad color labels, then the vocabulary expands. Red becomes crimson, blue becomes navy, green becomes turquoise or teal. The visual world becomes more finely divided, and every new word gives the mind another way to point. That does not mean language is a map that perfectly matches reality. It is not. Languages draw different boundaries, they emphasize different distinctions, they make some things easy to say and other things awkward to describe. So your vocabulary is not the world, it is one of the tools your brain uses to navigate the world. And that brings you back to the original question. How would you see the world if you had no words for color? You would not suddenly wake up in a black and white universe. You would still see the light. You would still see differences. You would still recognize familiar objects. But some of the boundaries you take for granted might feel less obvious, less immediate, or less useful. Because the strangest thing about perception is that seeing is only the beginning. Your eyes collect information, your brain organizes it, your experience gives it meaning, and language gives some of that meaning a name. So the next time you look at something and think, "That's blue," remember something strange. You're not simply describing what your eyes see. You're also revealing how your mind learned to divide the world. The color was there before the word. But once you learned the word, you never looked at that color in quite the same way again.